Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. In this one, I'm going to try and improve my ability to do object source lighting, or OSL. I'm also going to try and tackle a lava base, so if you're watching, then hopefully you'll get some tips if you want to try and do these techniques as well. It all starts with getting Anakin built and primed. For his base, I didn't do anything complicated. I just took 2 pieces of cork sheet, cut them into a small size to fit around his feet, and then stuck them to either side of the base, leaving the rest of it completely blank. I'm going to try and show you how to get an epic lava base with minimal effort, in terms of the build at least. For the object source lighting effect, I'm going to do a light from the left, that is his blue lightsaber. I'm going to do a light from below, which is lava, and then I'm going to do a light from the right side down, which will just be sort of normal ambient sunlight. So first things first, a bit of honesty to start, and that is the first time I tried to paint this miniature, I got it completely wrong. The reference image that I was using had all these colors in it. I think it was all reflected light from different studio lights or something like that. And I color dropped all of these purples and magentas, and I thought, oh, I should include those. So I tried, but it just ended up looking far too colorful, and I think it didn't actually portray what Anakin is dressed like. And it wasn't really what I was looking for, but I wanted to include this because it's a lesson in that sometimes things don't go your way the first time round, and you can just try again. The great thing about miniature painting is you can either paint over everything, or you can strip all the paint off, and you can just do it again. I am going to briefly show the wet palette because I am going to keep using this red tone. This red tone actually works really well for the leg parts on the model, but the purples and the magentas, they just didn't work. But I wanted to at least show that I tried and failed, because you can always try again. So continuing with that red mix I mentioned, it's a mix of gory red from Vallejo and charcoal, and it creates this really nice desaturated dark red that I added to his trousers. Anakin has a lot of different brown colors all over him, so I grabbed 3 different browns from my collection that I like, and I plan to use those on the paint job. Those were whole red from AK, charred brown from Vallejo, and Rhinox hide from Citadel. I used Rhinox hide for the arms, the inner chest part, and the sort of inner waist part. And then I used charred brown to base coat all of the leathery parts like the boots and the belt. On the palette, whole red actually seemed a lot brighter than the other 2 colors, so I actually ended up using it as a highlight color. So I mixed it into my Rhinox hide to do highlights on the inner robe parts, which is the arms, the inner chest, and the waist bit underneath his main big bits. With those main brown base coats down now, this is what the model looked like. Very early days, of course. Next, I'm going to go quickly through another round of highlights. And like I said, I was adding whole red to Rhinox hide for these arms inner robe parts. Then I added a tiny bit more gory red to the dark red mix that I was using on the legs. Then I added Vallejo model colors light brown to the charred brown that I was using on the leather parts. Because light brown's really different to the whole red that I'm using to mix into my Rhinox hide, I'll get a completely different direction of brown for the leather parts as opposed to his robe parts. I don't really remember when or where, but I remember reading a comment on someone else's channel that basically said object source lighting shouldn't be an afterthought, it should be something you plan right from the beginning. And to make sure I'm following that, I'm going to start painting in my object source lighting now. So I grabbed one of the darkest blues in my collection, which was Night Blue from Vallejo Game Color, and I began to add this over all the areas that I thought the lightsaber light would hit. When I see OSL effects online, I always prefer the more subtle ones, so I wanted to try and make it so that the light was really only on that left-hand side of his body. I didn't want it to go across his face or halfway across his chest or anything like that. And one key thing here about an OSL effect that I've learned from my research is that in order for it to seem viable and realistic, you have to have a dark color around your light. So where that blue I've just painted is, there needs to be a dark shadow line between it and any of the other highlight colors from the other directions on the miniature. I'm now going to do the exact same thing for the lava OSL, but I'm going to use a dark red mix instead. Because this light's going upwards, and again, I don't want it to be too far reaching across the model, it's only going to go on the underside of his legs. And I've made sure to start with what is an extremely dark red, and obviously for the blue parts it was an extremely dark blue as well. Because the initial dark red didn't stand out very well on the camera, I did then immediately do a second layer where I went a bit brighter with my red, so a bit more gory red in the mix, and I just added this to the middle of the legs, leaving a tiny bit of that darker red visible on either side, just to help strengthen this so that it would be visible at this stage to see where I'm putting in my object source lighting areas. With those OSL areas blocked in, it will help me when I highlight my non-OSL areas to ensure that those highlights don't overlap with any lighting for the OSL effect. And again, that's because there has to be a dark line of shadow separation between the OSL effects and any other lighting effects. With the initial OSL areas blocked in, it's time to go back and do another round of highlights on all the leathery and brown parts. I did want to just follow on from what I said at the end of my last video, which is that not every video can be a big diorama. Just at this stage, I want to be able to do smaller videos as well. Videos like this where I just paint a miniature and I just try and improve and hopefully share some knowledge and some tips to help you improve as well. So after those highlights, I wanted to move on to the black sections of the robes. I started by adding charcoal from Vallejo Game Color all over the areas that would be upward facing for the light. I use charcoal a lot. You've probably heard me talk about it if you've watched any of my other videos. I really love the charcoal paint from Vallejo because it gives you a really nice first highlight on anything black that you're painting. Because the grey is so dark, it's a really subtle highlight that it creates, which is really good for the initial sketching in of highlights. Because the light source is coming in from the right, I wanted to make sure that any upward faces on the bits below the waist or any of the shoulder parts that are more facing towards the light are going to get a hit of that lighter charcoal. I wanted to apply a base coat to the skin next so that I could see how that was going to start looking, and I used Skin Tone from Vallejo Game Color to do that. It took a few base coats, but once I had an opaque layer, I added some orange brown from Vallejo Model Color to my skin tone, and that created a slightly more desaturated and orangey skin tone that I could use for some of the shadows on the neck and the lower parts of the cheek. Then I wanted to put some paint on the hair, so I added orange brown, but just purely straight out the bottle this time, only with a little bit of water to thin it down, and then just added that straight to the hair to give me a nice orangey brown hair color. I then decided to jump around again and do another layer of highlights to all of the non-OSL areas across the model. So to be clear, that's the belt, boots, and robes. On this paint job, for some particular reason, I just ended up going up in highlights really gently and really sort of softly each time, and that's not a bad thing because it means that you get a slightly smoother lighting effect overall with all your different layers if you've got lots more layers involved. At this stage, here's a quick look at the mini. Next, I wanted to push the chest highlights even further. This black material that Anakin wears on his chest is really shiny in all the pictures I could find. That means I'm going to have to go for a pretty light grey highlight for my final highlight. But shininess can be really tricky, so I'm going to have to ensure that those highlights are really small. My initial pass of the highlights here is probably a little bit too big, so I'll fix them later on. But next up, I wanted to do some more highlighting on the face, so I started to add a lighter skin tone color called Pale Skin from Vallejo into my skin tone in order to create a brighter highlight. Because that was so bright, I wanted to make sure the rest of the model sort of matched. I mean, it wouldn't get as bright because these materials aren't shiny, but I needed them to still be highlighted and look a lot brighter. So I did another pass of highlights on all the brown robe parts and the boots and leathers and belts. The hair was looking a little bit flat, so I wanted to add a shadow color onto the hair. To do that, I added the Rhinox hide that I already had on my wet palette into my orange brown. Even though the hair has lots of individual strands, you can think of the whole shape as a volume as well, which is why all the undersides of the whole main shape of the hair I decided to cover in shadow, which is why most of the back of the hair is covered in the shadow color. I then highlighted the hair by adding light brown to the orange brown, which gave me a nice mix that I could begin to highlight with. By increasing the amount of light brown in the mix, I could create a second highlight that I then used on an even smaller region just on the top of the head. For some reason, I always tend to forget the eyebrows on my models, so this time I'd made sure that I painted in those eyebrows using the same colours as the hair. And highlighting these eyebrows in the same way makes a big difference, so I made sure I put a highlight along the top and a bit of dark line under the bottom. Next, it's eye time, and so I decided to put the whites in the eyes. I didn't film dotting the eyes because it took me ages and loads of failed attempts this time. I did not get lucky, but in the end I did get something I was quite happy with. In this clip, I'm going back to the black parts of the robe to reduce the size of my light highlights. And to make the difference really clear, here's a before and here's an after. so you can see that those white highlights are much smaller. And now it's time to turn my attention towards the lava, and I'd been itching to paint this, so I was really excited to get stuck in. Only for that excitement to be met with having to do about a bajillion coats of orange on the base. It's my fault really, I shouldn't have put orange straight over black. I also did a bit of red painting on the side of the rocky parts sticking out of the lava, which I will continue to work on as I go. And then while I was waiting for all my orange layers to dry, I covered my lightsaber in magic blue from Vallejo. Painting the lightsaber got me excited to paint more of my blue OSL effect, so I decided to do that next. I grabbed Imperial Blue from Vallejo Game Color and began to add it in a smaller area than the night blue that I'd added previously. The tricky thing about this was imagining the light going equally in a circle around the lightsaber, so I had to pick the points that were closest to the lightsaber to add the brightest highlights. Moving up to Magic Blue next, I began to add another layer of light highlights here on places that I thought were the closest, again, to the lightsaber. One interesting thing was that specifically as I was moving down the leg, I was trying to ensure that I was marking key points where each layer stopped. So this Magic Blue I only took as low as his trousers, but the previous layer of the Imperial Blue I had taken down to the top of the boots. This is what the model looked like when I had Magic Blue blocked in, although it was a bit intense, so I will go back later and lower that down a bit. So now it's time to go back to the lava OSL and to do a very similar thing, but to use red tones instead of blue. For these orangey reds, I used Army Painter Fanatics Oranges paint set, their Hexad of 6 colors, which are perfect for this kind of fiery lava painting. I used molten lava to build upon the reds that I'd used before, and I added that all over the underside of the legs. I did actually go on to change this later because this orange was a bit too intense, because the molten lava is actually the color I was using for the lava in the base, and I didn't want the lighting on the legs to match that when it was much higher up. The light would diffuse and get softer as it travels. I said at the beginning of the video that I'd share how I paint this lava base, and so this is how it starts. From this opaque orange base coat, I start to add some lighter yellowy orange. The paints in the Army Painter Fanatic range that I use for this are Molten Lava, Lava Orange, and Glowing Inferno. The Glowing Inferno is the yellowy one I'm adding. Most of the base is Lava Orange, as it's named, and then the rest of it's Molten Lava for like the sides of the rocks and stuff. It's not easy to see on camera, but I did actually add an orange ink to this as well, just to really try and intensify the lava color. I used a bit of feathering and a little bit of wet blending in order to get a really nice yellow soft streak in my lava. That will be important later for a bit of color variation, so your lava doesn't look really boring. I mentioned the orange I used before, and that was actually a little bit intense, so I'm coming in here with a mix of scarlet blood and black to create a really nice saturated red color that I can use, but the black helps it be not too saturated. I applied it all over the underside of the legs, and this color just seemed to work a lot better for the whole lighting effect. And then from this, I built up my brighter oranges as I went. I think the reason I did a bunch of other layers before was because I wasn't confident enough to go for this bright red initially. I thought all the light would have to be really dark for this effect to work, but you can actually get away with having quite a light color for this. And looking at the mini here, this is the point where things really started to look like they were actually being lit. For the core part of painting this lava base, it's all about adding these molten chunks of rock. And to do that, I grabbed my mix of gory red and charcoal, which gave me a really dark red, and I just began to draw tiny little shapes all over my lava base. These initial shapes are actually a bit small, and I would recommend going a little bit larger with your shapes, as you'll see I've done by the time I get to the end here. And this is kind of a similar effect to a crackle paint, but you've got more control over the gaps and where everything goes. To really enhance this, I did a second coat of the dark red all over all those rock parts to ensure that they were nice and deep and dark in color. And then I used a bit of that yellow, which is that glowing infernal paint from Army Painter, to add in a bit of difference of color and some more intense spots in the lava below these chunks. And I think this is a really great effect for what is relatively very little effort on this base, to be honest. To make the sides of the rocks match the lava, I had to start increasing the colors to get to more of those oranges that I've got in the lava to get them onto the side. And lower down the lava, things will be more intense. So in the deepest part at the bottom of those lava areas, I added my glowing inferno paint. Now that the paints for the lava are established, I can go onto the legs and I can make sure that I'm highlighting those up with the appropriate paints as well. So now I can go back in with my lava orange and begin to add this over the top of my scarlet blood layer. It's key to leave a little bit of that scarlet blood showing on the sides of the orange. It's also important to make sure the orange doesn't go all the way up the side of the leg. So once I got to that second strap of boot, I decided to stop the orange there. Using Glowing Inferno, which is a yellowy orange, I then added a final layer of highlights to the very lowest parts and only to the lowest strap of the leg so that it didn't go all the way as high as the previous layer. To tie the rocks into the environment more, they would need some ambient lighting. So I took my dark red mix and I began to add it all over the surfaces of the rocks. Even though they're facing away from the lava, all the light would be bouncing around. And the rock's proximity to the lava means that it would still get a lot of this light. But that's why the light is darker and I'm using a dark red instead of a normal orangey color. In this clip, I'm adding that intense glowing inferno to the bottom of the rocks. That will really tie them into the lava. They'll start to really look like they're hot at the bottom. With the lava OSL pretty much done, it was time to come back to the lightsaber OSL and to tone down that magic blue layer so that there was much less magic blue over these parts. So you see, I'm just covering them with the imperial blue from the previous layer. Sometimes I just go a bit over the top with my highlights initially, and then you sort of have a look at them and you see how you could improve them, and you tone them down a bit and suddenly they're looking way better. To finish off this blue lighting effect though, I'd need to go much brighter with my highlights, so I used sunrise blue to mix into the magic blue and began to add that to really tiny areas just closest to the lightsaber. Because this mix is really bright, I have to make sure I use it in only the tiniest amounts. And with the effect fixed up and with the new highlights, this is how the miniature looked at this point. I especially like it when you turn to the front because it makes the glow look even more effective in a way than when you're actually looking at it side on. Because I'm doing a lighting effect on this miniature, I wanted my lightsaber to be a bit more advanced than some of the lightsabers I've done on previous models, like the Grievouses I painted. And so I added a white line down the middle of the lightsaber. I started with sunrise blue and then moved up to a pure white. Lightsabers typically have a completely white core, but you can't really achieve that effect on a miniature. I wouldn't really know how, so you just have to kind of do the white line from the viewing angle, and in this case I chose a front-on viewing angle for my white line of light down the middle of my lightsaber. So that my two OSL effects matched, I decided to add a more yellowy orange to my OSL for the lava, just to make sure we have those really bright yellowy highlights, but I only brought those to just above the ankle. I didn't take them all the way up to those two horizontal straps on the boots. Because that yellow was more intense than the Glowing Inferno paint, I actually ended up using white and ice yellow to mix a brighter highlight for this. With now most of the OSL effects done, it's time to go around to the rest of the model, clean some stuff up and add some final highlights and details around. So started with the trousers and adding a slightly more red mix onto those. Next, it was for the inner robe parts that have that Rhinox hide mix, and I just kept going brighter. I started to add light brown to the mix that I already had between whole red and Rhinox hide, and then adding that as a highlight. The final highlights on the leather parts like the boots and the belt just included using more light brown in that mix as well. I think I got to almost pure light brown for this, and I wanted to make a real nice jump for that final highlight so that these parts really stood out and were defined. I wanted to just briefly mention that this lava base is of course actually supposed to be from Mustafar, where Anakin fights Obi-Wan, and it's obviously an iconic moment, so I really wanted to tie those two things together. My desire to paint a lava base, but also having this cool Anakin miniature in a canon location. Next up, I highlighted the face, once again using pale flesh to keep going brighter. I think I was almost pure pale flesh paint at this point. I just added it to the small parts of the face that stick most upwards, like the brow, the nose, and the top of the cheeks. The inner robe brown parts were still looking a little bit dull compared to everything else, so I wanted to go in with one much brighter highlight. So I mixed up much more light brown into the mix and started to add that to all the very tops of these areas. I wanted to include a bit of this video on how to do the back of the model. Because the light was coming from the right, the lightsaber's on the left, and the lava's from below, you could be left wondering, well, what do I do with the back of the model? And I'm no expert, but this is what I did. I basically looked at all the tones that I was using for my highlights on the other layers on the front side of the model, and I basically decided to highlight these parts on the back up, but only up to a certain level. So if I had done 5 layers of highlight on the front of the model, perhaps I only did 3 layers of highlights on the back. What this means is that the back of the model still gets a little bit of definition, but it doesn't go anywhere near as bright as the highlights on the front. And that keeps it distinct that there's much more light on the front of the model than there is the back. If you leave your back really, really dark, it will just kind of look unpainted, and that won't necessarily look as good unless it's the specific look that you're going for. This is also why it's really important to have a high level of contrast in all your highlights, because that means you've got plenty of places in the middle to work with for the back of your model or the sides of your model. In this clip, I'm doing that thing I mentioned earlier where I'm adding in a really dark line between the OSL effect and the highlights on the top of the arm. So you can see that I'm using a really dark brown here. I'm using Rhinox hide mixed with black to create a really dark brown that I'm adding in between to ensure that there's separation. Pretty much the last detail to paint on this model is the metallics. I tend to save these for last because I use a different palette and I use different water for them and different brushes as well. I used a similar mix to my last video where I mixed Vallejo silver with black to get a slightly darker silver, and then I put that all over my metals, and then I came in with a tiny bit of pure silver just for a final little edge highlight on all those metal bits to make them shine that little bit extra. And with the metals complete, that's pretty much the miniature done. So let's do the final look. I'm not claiming to be an expert on this technique, but this is the best OSL I've done in my hobby career so far. I've typically avoided this effect because I've been scared of it, and even in a past video you may have caught me suggesting that you should just add an ink over the top of what you've already painted to tint the colour. That's why I wanted to make this video, to really have a go at this technique, to do loads of research beforehand and then apply it and hope that that helps you as well. I also wanted the excuse of painting the lava base, which I think has turned out awesome and requires really basically no materials other than cork sheet and glue. I think this is a great springboard moment where I can now take what I've learned by doing this video and work on smoothing my OSL and improving my choice of paints and colors so that I can get even better at OSL in future videos. I'm hoping it's helped you understand a little bit more about OSL and lava bases as well. And I know this isn't a massive diorama like the last videos, but I can't make every video on the channel that. It's got to be some normal painting miniatures as well. Thanks if you watched the video, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.